Welcome to the third lecture on comparative politics. In this lecture, we're going to go over the basic concepts of political analysis, such as terms as regime, the state, political legitimacy, and sovereignty. Now, these are all big words, and they don't necessarily come into the comparison part of comparative analysis, but they're important to understand what we think are the basic components of a government and a state, and so we can compare them across different contexts. So the questions that are going to kind of behind this lecture are what is the difference between a government, just a formal government, the organizations and the individuals holding office, the state, which is a much slightly broader concept of what the governing organization is, and the regime, which is even a broader and more informal things and include things that are somewhat intangible. Secondly, how can we define the state? And here we're going to look at Max Weber's definition of the state as a political organization as a legitimate monopoly of force within territory. And lastly, when and why is a government considered legitimate and sovereign? So this diagram here shows you, I think, the different layers between government, state, and regime. Now, usually what a government means is the narrowest definition, and only includes people with formal authority or formal powers. So the people who actually have government jobs, such as appointed bureaucrats, civil servants, and also elected officials. That constitutes the government. And also you might say, if you wanted to beyond the individuals and the organizations, you might think of these as policies or specific legislation that is passed. And so the point is, this is the government, this is the actions of the government that you can see. However, political scientists tend to have a broader notion when they use the word state. And it comes partially because the word state goes back to a German concept and the idea of being the center of authority, and also that there's other different things that are key in supporting a particular government, which are not strictly part of the state, such as the political party in power. So, for example, in a particular country, you might have a dominant party. Now, the party is not a part of the state, such as a communist regime, such as the Communist Party of China or the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Or, for example, there's a single dominant party in places like Mexico or Sweden or Japan. And they interact with the official government, and they are part of what keeps them in power, but they're not part of the government. Another part could be allied interest groups, which means different interest groups that are very closely aligned with the state's goals. These could be a dominant industry. These could be, for example, a social or ethnic group that's not part of the government. It could be maybe perhaps a religious group. And they also support the state, but they're not officially part of the state. They also might be sometimes the way the state carries out its policies. So, for example, a state in many places in Europe, the schools were operated by the Catholic Church or by other type of organizations that weren't strictly in the secular part of the state. Another part of this might be the legal system. Now, the legal system might be part of the government in the sense that judges and courts are part of the government, but also the legal system is a set of rules and norms and activities and contracts that might, let's say, support the state or oppose the state. And finally, although I mentioned before, dominant ethnic group. If you have a dominant ethnic group that basically is not part of the state, is not officially recognized, but in some ways it controls the offices, it controls who gets appointed to certain things. Ethnic group leaders, such as chiefs in some African countries, might have more power than their formal powers within the government. The last broadest circle is the regime. And this is kind of the regime is that there are things that are fundamental to understanding why, let's say, a government has power, but they're not part of the government, they're not organized groups. It can be everything from ideas, it could be from the mainstream media, which in some senses codifies certain things. It could be key business leaders, it could be groups in civil society. It could be the international system that has certain laws about what they're going to tolerate and not tolerate. For example, that an international system might tolerate a particularly brutal regime, as long as it's allied with, let's say, a superpower, or might criticize a regime for violations or crimes against humanity against its own citizens. Sometimes there may be global financial markets. Global financial markets that are willing to make loans to different countries and not make loans to other countries. It could be religion. So, for example, in medieval Europe, the Catholic Church was part of what kept the government in power, because the Catholic Church and the Pope particularly recognized different people as the legitimate monarch in different countries. So the regime is kind of the biggest thing, and it includes everything from ideas, it includes things from as social groups, it includes things about the international environment. So the regime is probably the broadest circle, and involves us looking at other types of things that might be supporting the government power or define it, but are not strictly within the formal part of the government. So how should we define the state? Most political scientists go back to Max Weber in his essay Politics as a Vocation, where he defined the state as a political organization with a monopoly of legitimate force or legitimate power over a territory. And I think, other than political organization as part of this, I think there are three key elements here: legitimacy, authority, and sovereignty. And when we think about these three things, we can think of organizations that have two out of these three or one out of these three, and compare them with what we actually usually consider as governments or as states. So when I think of these as varieties of non-states or failed states. For example, we can think of an organization that has power and over territory, such as a gang or a mafia or a guerrilla group or terrorists. So various types of criminal syndicates have power and territory, but we generally don't consider them states because their power over their territory is not recognized as legitimate. They are seen as criminal organizations, and even though they might have a lot of power, and even though they might be the government, the existing power in a particular area, their power is never considered legitimate. Even by the people who use it, even by the members in it, they are, as the word says, they are outlaws, and meaning outside the law, they are not legitimate. We can think of legitimate political organizations, but do not have power and do not control territory. Many times you have a government in exile, particularly in times of civil war or world war. Probably the most prominent one today is Tibet, where there is a government. It's in northern India. You have the Dalai Lama leader. It's generally recognized by many people, but they have no power and they have no presence in their authority. During World War II, you had the Free French, who were not the official French government, but they were, let's say, a government in exile, and made a claim that most consider legitimate to be the true government of France. You have various protectorates around the world. And what's missing here is that none of these organizations have sovereignty. The Dalai Lama can say whatever he wants, but what's happening in Tibet is really responsive to what the government in Beijing of the People's Republic of China says they're going to do. And so they really don't have sovereignty. And finally, we can think of a political organization with legitimacy and territory, but without power, without authority. And this is what we might call a failed state. And this is what we have in the Sudan, Somalia, Afghanistan, where there is a political organization, there's a government in the capital. It's generally recognized legitimate, at least by other countries. They claim a certain territory, although they might not control all of it, but they can't collect taxes, they can't enforce the law. There are large parts of the country where it's unsafe to go, and even the members of the government, such as the armed force and the police, are afraid to do their job in those parts and certain regions of their country. So when we think about what's around in the world, we might think about, yes, there are a lot of states, but we're also things that wanted to be states that failed because they weren't able to achieve one of these three criteria. So let's look at legitimacy. The key misunderstanding about legitimacy is that many people think legitimacy means good. Like, a legitimate government is a government that does everything right, respects people's rights, is a democratic government, and that is not how comparative political scientists use the term. Legitimacy is a factual determination, not a normative evaluation. So you can have really evil states that are legitimate, such as Nazi Germany, apartheid South Africa, or Ba'athist Iraq. Now, these are all odious states. No one's saying they're good, but the question that political scientists would ask is, are they really the government over their territory in a certain period of time? And this became a major debate about whether Nazi Germany was taken over. Germany was taken over by the Nazis, i.e., that it was hijacked and therefore they were an illegitimate government, or whether they more or less had the acquiescence and acceptance of the rank and file of most German citizens. Um, Recently was a debate between the historian Christopher Browning and the political scientist Daniel Jonah Goldhagen, and it was ordinary Germans versus Hitler's willing executioners. Goldhagen argued that most Germans were completely down with the genocidal policies of the Nazi government, and therefore they should have some responsibility or share some culpability for what was going on. And on the other hand, they said, well, look, they were ordinary Germans. They did what they were told because they were in a country, but they weren't necessarily down. Many of them disagreed with the policies of the Nazi regime. Another example would be apartheid South Africa. That at least for at least part of the period, probably in the 1950s and 1960s, more or less the government of South Africa was recognized by world governments, that it more or less had at least the for parts of the period, although I don't want to go too much in the details, where they had the acquiescence of most of their citizens, including the black South Africans. So there's this thing about that is that as political scientists, we're not here to judge these countries. We're here to say, are they effective countries? Do they actually enforce the law? Do they get cooperation on the part of their citizens or subjects? But on the other hand, also that good states can be illegitimate, such as the Baltic states from 1918 to 1989. They weren't considered, they were good states, but they were considered illegitimate, governments in exile. So how do states become legitimate? Well, there's really two pathways. Remember, this is empirical. This is not saying whether they should be legitimate. This is whether they are actually legitimate. The first one is they get recognized by other states. This usually happens because they exchange diplomats. So ambassadors come to our country. We send ambassadors to that country. We're recognizing them as the official government and the one we will deal with for any kind of affairs that happen within their territory. Membership in international organizations. Are they accepted by the EU, the United Nations? Not everything that's a government is recognized in the United Nations. And, for example, just recently when Scotland wanted to become independent, it wasn't clear that Scotland was going to be accepted into the European Union or what its status would be. And lastly, there's a recognition of borders, and very often countries spend a lot of time really delineating exactly where the borders are, and that they don't violate those borders, and they accept the jurisdiction of the countries within those borders, whether they agree with the policies, whether they agree with the laws in those countries or not. The second pathway is whether they're accepted by its own citizens or, in some cases, subjects. And what does acceptance mean? It means, do people participate in the political process? Do they vote? Do they abstain? Very often some people say, well, I'm really so frustrated in my country, I'm not going to participate. I'm going to cast a non-vote because I'm sick of the entire system. I'm not going to participate in the political process. Other people might say, well, I'm not going to pay my taxes because I disagree with the government. I don't recognize its legitimacy. When people participate, generally that's saying, well, we accept the government as legitimate, even if the government doesn't always do what I want it to do. Our laws regularly obeyed. And here we get into the whole idea of civil disobedience. That basically what civil disobedience is trying to challenge the legitimacy of the government because it's engaged in some odious activity. And by civil disobedience, we are saying we don't recognize the government as legitimate, at least in this one area. And the last one is, are taxes paid and collected? If the government can't collect taxes, the government people are basically saying we don't recognize that they have a right to collect taxes from us to pay for these services. And this happens from time to time, and it's a really good indicator of whether people consider the government legitimate. So, I mentioned that one of the things that states become legitimate is the recognition by other countries. And so one thing we might want to look at is famous cases of non-recognition where countries have not recognized seeming countries as being legitimate or not being the official government of the particular country. Most recently, we have the ongoing events between the Russian Ukraines, such as the Donetsk Republic, which is the eastern Ukraine, which are ethnic Russians who want to leave the Ukraine and maybe form their own government or join Russia as a country. Generally, people have not recognized the Donetsk Republic as a legitimate government, including the American government. Also involved with Russian interventions in the region are the countries of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. These were created by the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008. because they were formed as a result of an aggressive action against the country of Georgia. In general, most countries around the world have not recognized these two countries as countries. However, Russia does recognize them as countries, and because they are more or less, Russia is the most powerful country in the region, they have some, let's say, existence in that sense. Probably one of the more famous ones are the ongoing Israel-Palestine issue, where you have mutual non-recognition of Palestinians for Israel and Israel for Palestinians. You might often hear the phrase that the Palestinians do not recognize Israel's right to exist, and very often what happens is because the Israeli Defense Forces will often cross the borders into Gaza Strip and also into the West Bank, that they don't really respect or always accept the government of the Palestinians as the legitimate government. Another ongoing civil war is in the country of North Cyprus. Cyprus is divided between ethnic Turks and ethnic Greeks, and so it is divided and has been divided, and so North Cyprus sometimes has declared itself as a separate government, but it has not been recognized by most countries in the world. Another part to this are countries divided by the Cold War, such as Taiwan and mainland China. And another one is North and South Korea. Many people don't realize the Korean War has never ended, that actually it is just in a ceasefire, and that North Korea still has a claim on the entirety of Korea, and so does South Korea has a claim on the entirety of Korea, which is not settled. And for different times, the different allies of those two countries recognized or did not recognize one or the other. But probably more interesting is the case of Taiwan and mainland China. For many years, mainland China was not considered a legitimate government, and the UN recognized Taiwan as the government of China and gave it its seat on the Security Council. And this changed in the 1970s and 1980s, where it switched where Taiwan is now not recognized, but mainland China is. In the view of mainland China, Taiwan is just a rebellious province that really is part of China, and one day will be returned or restored to China. And so you have these kind of curious things on that are functions of being non-recognized as a country, which is that you couldn't get flights from Taiwan to China or from Taipei, Taiwan's capital, to Beijing. And so what would happen when you had these international flights and Hong Kong was still considered a separate British territory, you would have flights take off from Taipei, they would go to Hong Kong airport, they would touch the ground, and then immediately take off and fly to Beijing, because by touching the ground they could claim they did not come from Taiwan, they came from Hong Kong, which did have some recognition. A similar story is Cuba, which has not been recognized by the United States or the American allies, and I still think you cannot get a direct flight from American airport to Havana. Historically, another example of this is the state of Manchukuo, a puppet state of Japan that was created during World War II when Japan invaded northeast China. So Max Weber basically said there's three types of authority, and they all have a different basis of legitimacy. The first one is traditional authority, and this is where things are validated by custom. So, for example, a prince inherits the kingdom from the king, i.e., usually his father, and there's kind of a chain of descent or a chain of inheritance that determines who will be the next ruler of a country. In the Middle Ages, you had feudal obligations, where basically someone was lord and they required deference and obedience and contributions, and on the other hand, customarily, they were to take care of their vassals. This also gets into this idea of primordial nationalism, or something that's called jus sanguinis, which means the law of blood. That nationalism basically goes back very, very far. It's basically descent from an original ancestor, and its origins are lost in time immemorial. It's also the basis for divine right rule that was often asserted by the absolute monarchs in Europe in the 16 and 1700s. The second type of authority is called charismatic authority, and this means really that they're validated by God. The core word there, charism, it means basically anointed by God. And these are the types of leaders that really have no formal base for their authority, but because of their charisma, because of their charismatic ability to attract people, prophets and visionaries, revolutionary leaders, as long as they're successful, people are willing to follow them. And so very often this is very disruptive, or how authority is in transitional times in politics. The third, that's very common in the modern world, is rational legal authority, which means there are rules and procedures, and decisions and authority comes from obeying these rules and procedures. So, for example, if you want to know who's president, you look at the Constitution, you see the procedures for selecting a president, you see who is qualified and not qualified to be president, and if they meet those criteria, then that person is declared president. So essentially, rational legal authority is constitutional government, where government can basically go back. You can look at a constitution, you can derive the rules from the constitution, the procedures for making rules and new rules, and that's how government proceeds. And a core part of this is also bureaucracy, where the power of the bureaucrats doesn't come because they're someone's nephew or someone else's uncle. They come because they have an office. And in that office, they have certain powers to do things, whether it's to make determinations, set statutes, rules, etc. And as opposed to primordial nationalism, rational legal authority is more about a rational nationalism, a nationalism where people decide to be what ethnicity they want to be, and therefore it's something that's chosen. For example, we can declare yourself to be a citizen of this country or that country, and you don't necessarily have to be blood related or genetically descended from a particular group. Finally, just to make another connection, rational legal authority is essentially what social contract theory of Locke, Hobbes, and Rousseau is, that there has to be some rational basis to the authority, which means if someone has power, it has to be justified. It can't just be because you happen to be the son of the previous king, or, for example, that you claim to be a prophet and you claim to come with this ideology that's going to change everything. There has to be a recognized logic. And just to go a little bit more into this, we can look at the logic of legitimacy, the different types of rulers, how positions are determined, how people are connected with their subjects or their citizens, what holds the polity together, and also what types of leadership are recognized in these different types of systems of legitimacy. Now, one particular form of legitimacy is nationalism. And nationalism really comes from the belief that every nation should have its own state. And particularly, what a nation state is that the state should govern in the interest of a particular nation, which means that there's some majority or some ethnic group that basically defines the nation. And that's whose interest the government should make its decisions, not the minority. So, for example, it should be China for the Chinese, but the Tibetans and Uyghurs, you have to wait in line. Sometimes you hear this in American debates where people refer to true Americans or real Americans, and some immigrant groups or some are not really recognized as being fully American and therefore don't have the same claim on the policies and also the assistance of the formal mechanisms of government. Nationalism is also this idea that for every nation should have one state, one nation per state, and so you get often this where you see states breaking up as local ethnic and regional and religious groups are asserting wanting to break away. And also in other cases where minorities in one country want to break away and join a neighboring country where they will be part of the majority. And it's important to recognize that this idea of nationalism is a relatively modern and new idea. Before 1789 with the French Revolution, the norm was multi-ethnic empires. Whether it was China, whether it was Russia, whether it was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, whether it was Prussia, whether it was the British Empire, people generally did not have a problem that there were many different ethnicities and very many different peoples all belonging in the same political unit. But the French Revolution spurred a whole series of events that led to this idea of a nation state, partially because the French used nationalism as a way of mobilizing their citizens, and people saw that as the basis of the power of Napoleon and others. Everyone said, well, the only way to react to the French development is to create our own nation state. And you saw some other steps. In World War I, you saw Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, which enshrined one of their doctrines of national self-determination, which is that every nation should be able to determine its own form of government. And then after World War II, you saw widespread decolonization, where the colonial empires of Europe broke apart, and you saw many different nationalist movements claiming different parts of the empires and setting up new governments, including most of the governments in South Asia and Africa. Now, the final part of this is that many people think the 21st century, and particularly the globalization, which is considered the dominant trend of the 21st century, is going to mean the end of the nation state. which means people's loyalties are not going to be tied to the nation state, but they're going to be tied either to a civilization, an ethnic group, or this idea of one world or national cosmopolitan culture. So sovereignty. Uh, Basically what sovereignty means is that sovereign states are autonomous. And autonomous means they have control in their own sphere of influence, which means, first of all, they are free to make their own laws, and those are the laws that will land within their borders, and also that their borders and the integrity of their borders is respected, which means other countries do not cross their borders with their own military troops, that they don't go and pursue criminal investigations across national borders when they've been forbidden by the government. Um, and basically, this is a defining characteristic of governments, is that this idea that within your borders you can do more or less anything you want, including mistreat your own citizens. Um, but recently you see some threats to sovereignty, and these are going to come up this year when we discuss different countries. The first one is the growth of supranational institutions. So these are institutions that are above the nation state, where nation states have given them some authority over certain aspects and certain policies, and therefore do not have control over these policies within their borders in the way they used to have. So these institutions include the European Union, the United Nations, economic ones such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Trade Organization, and most particularly the International Criminal Court, which means can, let's say, national leaders be put on trial for crimes against humanity. And this became a big issue when Augusto Pinochet, the military leader of Chile in the 1970s and 1980s, was put on trial because it was considered for crimes against humanity. More recently, including different leaders in Yugoslavia during the 1990s who committed crimes, and just what happened in the last year, the Khmer Rouge of Cambodia, where some of the leaders were put on trials for the Cambodian genocide. The second thing is these collective security alliances. This is probably most famously from American history with the League of Nations, that if the Americans became part of the League of Nations, they would no longer have control of their own foreign policy. In effect, they would not be autonomous. But more recently, where there's a threat to sovereignty, is that there are foreign troops on domestic soil. And very often what this means is that these are American troops with bases in various different countries in the world. The third challenge is economic, and this is the growth of international global markets, and particularly the movements of international capital. So now you have multinational corporations that are much larger than most countries and operate in many different countries and are able to move resources from one country to another. And also financial markets that are moving, let's say, trading in currencies, trading in debt, trading in different equities. And this has undermined the power of different nations to regulate economic activity within their borders. Fourth, you have occupied and disputed territories, where a weaker country is more or less leaned upon by a more powerful country. And you have this in the Kashmir in northern India, between India and Pakistan, Tibet and China. You have the ongoing Israel-Palestinian disputes, where the West Bank and Gaza are not really considered fully sovereign because the Israeli Defense Forces regularly will cross those borders and do not feel that this is termed as an invasion or a declaration of war. And what's happened over the past summer, the breakaway of Crimea and the Donetsk Republic in eastern Ukraine, and so where Russians sent troops across the Ukrainian borders to go assist the Crimeans and also various different groups that were within the territory of the Ukraine. Finally, and mostly in the developed world, you have civil wars where people are crossing borders, refugees, different ethnic groups within countries, across countries, and you have this in Sudan, in Darfur, you have this ongoing in Cyprus, and now you're kind of sort of seeing this thing with ISIS in the Syria and Iraq borderlands, where effectively the sovereignty of the Iraqi and the Syrian governments is no longer a real thing when you have a group like ISIS that's able to move men and material across borders more or less at will. So just to think about this issue of sovereignty, in two countries, one the Great Britain, but also Iran. And the graphic on the left shows you Iran, and the little stars show you various different American military bases. And if you look at this, you can understand why Iran sometimes feels very threatened, because it seems it's encircled by other by the United States, who basically flies over these countries, is conducting military and drone activities, and many countries feel like their sovereignty is no longer being respected, and this is a basic issue about sovereignty in the world. On the other hand, you see the various different overlapping supranational institutions that cross various different European countries, these different circles that have some European countries and not others. And all these different organizations have control over some policies, whether it's trade policy, whether it's economic regulation, whether it's cultural policy, and all these have, in a sense, limited the power of different publics to control their government because their government doesn't have control over policies that affect their lives.